The cruise was everything I had imagined and more. As the massive ship left the port, I couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. It was my first time on such a grand ship, and the promise of endless activities and new experiences made me giddy. My parents were equally thrilled, though they seemed more interested in lounging by the pool and trying out the various restaurants. That night, there was a big party on the main deck. Music, colorful lights reflecting off the dark ocean, and people of all ages dancing and laughing. The atmosphere was electric, and I couldn't wait to dive into the action. I wandered off on my own, eager to meet people my age, feeling the warm night breeze against my skin and the soft hum of the ocean in the background. The ship felt like a floating city, bustling with life. Everything seemed perfect, safe even. It was a place where I could let my guard down, away from the usual worries of school or home. I wasn't thinking about danger or about strangers with bad intentions. After all, who would on a ship like this? That's when I noticed them. 3 guys, probably in their early 20s, casually walking toward me. They smiled, friendly enough, and introduced themselves. "We're heading to the bar later. You should join us," one of them said with a grin. It felt like the beginning of a new friendship, and I was all for it. The guys seemed cool, cracking jokes and asking about where I was from. I told them I was traveling with my parents, and they nodded understandingly. "We've been on this cruise a few times," one of them, Mark, said. "It's way more fun when you make friends along the way." I agreed, feeling more at ease. We talked for a bit longer, and then they invited me to meet up later, suggesting we hang out in their room after the party wrapped up. At first, I didn't think much of it. It sounded harmless enough. But there was something in their eyes, a slight edge that made me hesitate. Maybe I was just being paranoid. After all, they had been nothing but nice. Still, something about the suggestion of heading to their room didn't sit right with me. I told them I needed to check in with my parents first, but Mark waved it off. "Come on, man. You're not a kid anymore, right?" he teased, with a slight smirk that seemed friendlier than it was. I laughed it off, but my mind was racing. Suddenly, I wasn't sure if this was such a great idea. The way they crowded me felt wrong. My gut instinct told me to walk away, but I didn't want to seem rude or afraid. The more they insisted, the more uneasy I felt. Their friendly banter started to feel forced, and the way they kept pushing me to join them in their room became more persistent. Mark leaned in a little closer, his hand resting casually on my shoulder. "Come on, it'll be fun. We've got drinks up there, way better than the stuff at the bar," he said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes this time. I forced a laugh, trying to mask my discomfort. My heart started to race, and I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. Something about this was off, really off. I looked around, trying to spot my parents or anyone I recognized, but the deck was crowded with people dancing and drinking. No one seemed to notice the tension building in this little circle. "Look, I really should go check in with my parents. They'll be wondering where I am," I said, trying to keep my voice light, even though I was starting to panic inside. One of the other guys, Jake, crossed his arms and stared at me, his friendly demeanor fading. "You're not a kid, man. You don't need to check in with anyone." That's when it hit me. I needed to get out of there. I glanced around again, hoping for an opening, but they were standing too close, and the crowd was packed tight. Every exit seemed blocked. I felt trapped. "Maybe later," I said, trying to back away, but Mark stepped in front of me. "Don't be a loser," he said, his voice lowering, the friendliness now completely gone. My pulse quickened. I had to leave, and I had to leave now. Without saying another word, I spotted my chance, a small gap in the crowd. I didn't think twice. I ducked through the opening and quickly moved toward the edge of the dance floor, slipping between people as fast as I could without drawing attention. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that I could barely hear the music anymore. I glanced back, hoping they hadn't followed. To my relief, I didn't see them, but I couldn't stop yet. I weaved through the crowd, keeping my head down, and headed straight for the nearest exit that led into the quieter halls of the ship. Once I was out of the throng of partygoers, I broke into a light jog, desperate to put as much distance between me and those guys as possible. The ship was massive, and I had no idea where I was heading. I just needed to find my parents. The corridors were dimly lit, the sound of the party fading behind me as I ran through the seemingly endless hallways. My breath came in short gasps, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced they might be following me. Finally, I spotted the familiar hallway leading to our cabin. I rushed inside, slamming the door behind me. My parents were sitting on the bed, looking up in surprise. "What's wrong?" my mom asked, her eyes widening at the sight of me, clearly out of breath. "I think someone was trying to set me up," I stammered, unsure of how to explain everything that had just happened. After I caught my breath, I told my parents everything about the guys, their insistence, and how uncomfortable I had felt. My dad listened with a frown, but my mom seemed more anxious than angry. "They were probably just being idiots," my dad said, trying to downplay the situation. "But you did the right thing by getting out of there." I nodded, but the unease in my chest hadn't faded. Something about the whole encounter didn't feel like just idiots being pushy. There was an edge to them, something darker. My mom, sensing my lingering fear, put a hand on my shoulder. "You're safe now. Try not to worry about it. Just stay close to us for the rest of the trip, okay?" I agreed, though sleep wouldn't come easy that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic hum of the ship's engines and the occasional creak as it cut through the water. Every now and then, I thought I heard footsteps outside our cabin door, but I told myself it was just my imagination. Still, my mind kept replaying the night, how they had surrounded me, how Mark's smile had turned from friendly to something predatory. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something terrible. I eventually drifted into a restless sleep, but even then, I dreamed of being chased through the endless corridors of the ship, unable to find a way out. The next morning, the ship was buzzing with the usual excitement of the last day. Passengers were packing up, making last-minute plans for dinner or a final dip in the pool. But I couldn't shake the sense of dread that clung to me from the night before. I stuck close to my parents, as promised, but my eyes kept darting around, scanning every face in the crowd. Every young guy with dark hair or a baseball cap made my heart skip a beat. I half expected to see Mark, Jake, or one of the others lounging by the pool or casually leaning against the bar, watching me. But they were nowhere to be found, and the day passed in an uncomfortable blur. We had a late lunch together, and while my parents chatted happily about the trip, I could hardly focus on the conversation. The sun was shining, the ocean was calm, and the ship felt like a floating paradise, but I couldn't relax. When we finally headed back to our cabin to pack, I felt a strange sense of relief. The cruise was almost over, and soon, we'd be on solid ground, far away from the guys I had met. But that sense of safety wouldn't last long. As we returned to our cabin, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease just a little. We were almost done. Just one more night and we'd be off this ship. I started packing my things, eager to have everything ready so I could just relax for the rest of the evening. That's when I found it. Tucked between my clothes and the suitcase was a small, folded piece of paper. At first, I thought it was just something I had misplaced earlier, maybe a receipt or a note from my mom reminding me to pack something. But when I unfolded it, my blood turned cold. "See you on dry land," the note read, in handwriting that looked hurried and sharp. For a second, I just stared at it, trying to process what I was seeing. My mind raced. How had this gotten into my suitcase? Who put it there? I knew immediately who it was from. It had to be Mark or one of the others. Somehow, they had been in our room. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt my stomach drop. The sense of safety I had started to feel evaporated in an instant. They hadn't forgotten about me. They were watching. I wasn't sure what their plan was, but the message was clear. They weren't done with me yet. I quickly shoved the note into my pocket and looked over at my parents, who were still packing their own bags, completely unaware of the horror that had just unfolded. I wanted to tell them, but what could I say? Would they even believe me? My dad had already brushed off my concerns once, and my mom would probably just panic. No, I couldn't tell them. Not yet. But I couldn't keep this to myself either. I had to do something. The idea of those guys waiting for me when we got off the ship made my skin crawl. What did they want? My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I needed to stay calm. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a cruel joke, nothing more. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. They were coming for me. The next morning, we disembarked with the rest of the passengers. The port was crowded with people, families pulling their luggage, taxis honking as they lined up, and tourists chatting excitedly about their trips. To anyone else, it was just another day. But to me, every shadow felt like a threat, every face in the crowd a potential danger. I couldn't stop scanning the area, looking for Mark, Jake, or any of the others. My pulse quickened with every glance, certain I would spot them at any moment. The note had been weighing heavily in my pocket, a constant reminder that this wasn't over. They were out there, somewhere. "Are you okay?" my mom asked as we waited in line to pass through customs. She must have noticed the way I kept glancing around, my shoulders tense. "Yeah, just ready to get home," I lied, managing a weak smile. But my eyes never stopped moving. Every man in a baseball cap, every group of young guys laughing and joking, made my stomach twist in knots. I wanted to run, but where? Even though we were finally off the ship, I didn't feel safe. I felt exposed, vulnerable. We made our way through customs and out into the bustling streets of the port city. The sun was shining, the air warm and salty. It should have been a relief to be off the ship, away from the closed-in hallways and eerie corridors. But the open space only made the fear worse. Were they following me? Watching from a distance? I had no way of knowing. My parents were oblivious, already talking about where we'd eat lunch before catching our flight home. But all I could think about was the note and the threat it carried. As we loaded our luggage into a taxi, I took one last look around, half expecting to see a familiar face in the crowd. Nothing. But that didn't mean they weren't there. Even as we drove away from the port, the fear stayed with me. I knew I'd never truly feel safe again. Not until I knew for sure that they were gone, or until they found me. The day had finally arrived. Mark, his wife Sarah, and their 5-year-old son, Ethan, boarded the cruise they'd been dreaming about for months. After a stressful year balancing work and family life, this trip was supposed to be the perfect getaway. The ship was massive, a floating city with endless pools, restaurants, and activities. Ethan's excitement was contagious, running ahead of them, marveling at every little thing, his eyes wide with curiosity. The first day passed smoothly. They spent the afternoon by the pool, watched the sun sink into the horizon, and savored the quiet luxury of being away from the real world. Everything felt right. That evening, as they wandered along the deck after dinner, the soft breeze brushing against their skin, Mark noticed a woman standing alone by the railing, her dark hair whipping in the wind. There was something about her, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to appear. Mark's gaze lingered for a moment before they moved on, unaware of the shadow that had just fallen over their peaceful vacation. The second day was just as perfect as the first. They spent hours lounging by the pool while Ethan splashed around in the kids' area. But that night, everything changed. As Mark and Sarah were enjoying a quiet moment on the deck after Ethan had fallen asleep, the woman from the night before appeared again. This time, she approached them. Her name was Emily, she said, and she was clearly shaken. Her voice trembled as she explained she was running from someone, a man she claimed was following her. Sarah's immediate instinct was to offer comfort, while Mark's guard went up. Something about her story didn't sit right with him. "We can help," Sarah said, looking at Mark for agreement. Mark hesitated but nodded. Emily seemed vulnerable, and Sarah's compassionate nature won out. Over the next few days, Emily became a near-constant presence around them. She always seemed to appear wherever they were. At meals on the deck, near the pool where Ethan played. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He watched her closely, but there was never any direct threat, just a lingering sense of unease. Late one evening, while Sarah was putting Ethan to bed, Mark decided to visit the ship's customer service desk. He needed to know more about Emily, about why she seemed to be everywhere. When he asked if she was a registered guest, the staff gave him a confused look. "There's no one by that name on board," they said. Mark's stomach tightened. Who was this woman really? After discovering that Emily wasn't on the passenger list, Mark couldn't shake his unease. The next morning, he decided not to tell Sarah about what he had learned just yet. She seemed relaxed for the first time in months, and he didn't want to worry her without more concrete proof. Still, his mind raced with possibilities. Who was this woman, really? What was she hiding? Mark kept a closer eye on Emily throughout the day. She continued to show up wherever they went, always with a friendly smile, always finding a way to engage with Sarah and Ethan. Sarah seemed to have completely bought into Emily's story, empathizing with her plight. Ethan, ever the curious and friendly child, quickly warmed to her as well, often pulling her hand to join them in games. By late afternoon, Mark's patience had worn thin. He pulled Sarah aside, away from Emily's earshot. "There's something off about her," he whispered urgently. "She's not on the passenger list." Sarah frowned, clearly torn. Maybe she gave a fake name. Who knows what kind of danger she's in? Mark? We can't just turn our backs on her. Mark clenched his jaw. It didn't feel right, but Sarah's compassion was hard to argue with. He resolved to keep watching, hoping he was wrong. 2 days later, the atmosphere on the ship had shifted. It was subtle at first. Whispers among the passengers, uneasy glances exchanged between parents. By the time they reached the third day of the cruise, news had spread. 2 children had gone missing from the ship's daycare center. Mark felt the knot of dread in his stomach tighten. His worst fears were beginning to materialize. The cruise staff assured everyone that a full investigation was underway, but the sense of safety on the ship had been shattered. Every parent clutched their children a little tighter. Sarah became more protective of Ethan, and Mark couldn't help but notice that Emily seemed unusually calm about the situation. That evening, as they sat for dinner, Mark kept glancing at Ethan, who was playing with a small toy car at the table. Emily joined them, her usual quiet demeanor still intact, but Mark could barely focus on the conversation. His mind was racing with thoughts of the missing children. When Ethan tugged on Emily's sleeve, asking her to play with him, Mark's heart skipped a beat. He stood up abruptly, causing the chair to screech against the floor. Sarah and Emily looked at him, startled. "I'll take him to play," Mark said quickly, trying to keep his voice steady. "I think it's best he stays close." Emily's eyes met his, and for the briefest moment, Mark thought he saw a flicker of something dark, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. That night, as they put Ethan to bed, Mark couldn't shake the overwhelming feeling that they were being watched. He knew he needed answers soon, or they might be next. Mark woke up the next morning with a tightness in his chest. His dreams had been filled with shadowy images of Emily, and the missing children haunted him. He decided that enough was enough. He couldn't stand by and wait for something to happen to Ethan. After breakfast, while Sarah took Ethan to the pool, Mark set out to speak with one of the senior members of the crew. He found a quiet moment with one of the ship's security officers, a man named Paul who seemed trustworthy enough. Mark explained his suspicions, telling him about Emily, the fact that she wasn't on the passenger list, and the sudden disappearances. Paul's face grew serious. "We've had a few incidents in the past," he said in a low voice, leaning closer. "Nothing we could ever fully prove, but there have been whispers about groups targeting cruise ships. Kidnappings." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "You think she's involved?" Paul hesitated before nodding slightly. "It's possible. There was a case a few years ago. A woman matching her description was linked to a series of disappearances in the Caribbean. The authorities never caught her." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. He needed to tell Sarah immediately. "You have to help me. I think she's targeting my son." The officer nodded, his expression grim. "We'll keep an eye on her, but you need to be careful. Don't let her know you're onto her." Mark returned to the pool area, his mind racing. When he found Sarah and Ethan, Emily was sitting nearby, watching them. The unease that had been gnawing at him for days now turned into full-blown fear. He had to convince Sarah. He had to protect Ethan at all costs. That night, as they were putting Ethan to bed, Mark finally told Sarah everything. She was initially shocked, then angry that he had kept the information from her for so long. But as he spoke, he could see the realization slowly dawning on her face. Emily wasn't who she said she was. And then Ethan was gone. Panic overtook Mark and Sarah in an instant. Ethan had been there just moments before, sound asleep in his bed, and now the bed was empty. Mark's mind went blank, fear tightening his chest as he bolted out of the room, shouting Ethan's name. Sarah followed closely, her face pale with terror. They ran down the halls, calling for their son, but there was no sign of him. Desperation clawed at Mark as he searched the deck, his heart racing. Every parent's worst nightmare had become his reality. It wasn't long before they found Paul and other members of the crew. Paul immediately called for the ship to be locked down, preventing anyone from leaving. "We've already checked the security cameras," Paul said urgently. "Emily was seen leaving your cabin with Ethan." Mark's fear turned to rage. He clenched his fists as Paul explained the situation. "She's probably trying to reach one of the lesser-used exits near the storage areas. We need to move fast." Mark, Sarah, Paul, and a team of security staff combed through the ship, their search narrowing as they followed every possible path Emily might have taken. The once peaceful ship now felt like a maze of fear and danger, the once friendly faces of the crew now grim and determined. Finally, they reached the lower deck, near the cargo hold. There, in a dimly lit corridor, they spotted Emily, holding Ethan's hand. She was speaking to two men, her accomplices, who were waiting for her. Mark's pulse quickened. "That's her," he yelled, his voice cracking. The security team moved quickly, surrounding Emily and her accomplices before they could react. Mark rushed forward, his eyes locked on Ethan, who looked confused and frightened but unharmed. "Dad!" Ethan cried, breaking free from Emily's grip and running into Mark's arms. As Paul and the other officers arrested Emily and her men, Mark held Ethan tightly, tears streaming down his face. He had found his son, and they were safe. But the realization of how close they had come to losing him shook Mark to his core. Emily stared coldly as they took her away, the facade of innocence gone. Mark felt a wave of relief, but he knew they had barely escaped a nightmare. As the authorities processed Emily and her accomplices, the ship's crew began to uncover the full extent of the operation. It was more than just a few people. Emily had been part of a larger kidnapping ring that targeted families on luxury cruises, preying on their trust and exploiting moments of relaxation to take what was most precious, their children. In the following hours, the ship's security found evidence linking Emily to several previous cases. Passports, fake IDs, and disturbing plans were discovered hidden in the accomplice's luggage. The crew made sure that all children on board were accounted for, and an extra layer of security was implemented to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. Mark and Sarah, still reeling from the events, stayed close to Ethan for the rest of the trip. Their relief was palpable, but the fear lingered. The family sat together on the deck the next day, watching the ocean stretch out endlessly before them. What had started as a dream vacation had turned into their worst nightmare, but they had escaped, and that was all that mattered now. "I'm just glad we're together," Sarah whispered, squeezing Mark's hand. He nodded, still holding Ethan close. They couldn't help but think of the other families who hadn't been so lucky. The cruise continued, but for Mark and Sarah, nothing felt the same. When the ship finally docked, the authorities were waiting to take Emily and her accomplices into custody. Mark and Sarah gave statements, detailing everything that had happened. The news quickly spread through the media, turning Emily's face into a symbol of fear for families everywhere. Back home, life resumed its rhythm, but the scars of the experience remained. Ethan was too young to fully understand what had happened, but he seemed more clingy, unwilling to leave his parents' side for long. Mark and Sarah, though grateful to be back in their familiar surroundings, found themselves more protective, more cautious about the world around them. Mark, especially, couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to losing Ethan. He often replayed those moments of terror in his mind. Emily's cold smile, the empty bed, the frantic search. It haunted him, but it also taught him a valuable lesson. His instincts had been right all along. As they sat together one evening, watching Ethan play, Sarah turned to him. "We'll be okay, right?" Mark smiled softly, though the weight of the experience still hung heavy in his heart. "Yeah, we'll be okay. We've got each other." They had faced the unimaginable, and though the ocean was vast, they had learned that danger could lurk anywhere. But as long as they had each other, they could face anything. I'm not the type to take spontaneous trips, but after a stressful year at work, I needed a break more than anything. That's how I ended up on this cruise with my two best friends, Sarah and Emily. We've been talking about a vacation for months, and when Emily found a great deal on a week-long Caribbean cruise, we couldn't resist. The ship was incredible, luxurious, with endless things to do. Sun loungers lined the deck, and the sound of soft music mixed with the laughter of other passengers. I could already feel the tension in my shoulders melting away as we sailed further into the open sea. The first 2 days were a blur of cocktails, sunbathing, and exploring the ship. It was the perfect escape from the routine of daily life. There was something so freeing about being out on the water, away from everything. Little did I know that this sense of freedom would soon turn into something much darker. As evening fell on the second day, we decided to head to one of the ship's fancy restaurants for dinner. That's when I saw him for the first time. He was standing near the bar, casually chatting with the bartender. Tall, well-dressed, and effortlessly handsome. He caught my eye immediately. "Looks like someone's got a crush," Sarah teased, nudging me. I laughed it off, but there was something about him that intrigued me. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The next morning, as I was grabbing a coffee by the pool, there he was again. This time, he was closer, just a few feet away, reading a book. I felt a little flutter of nerves in my stomach, but I tried to play it cool. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, smiling warmly. I was a bit surprised, but I nodded, moving my things aside. "Sure." We started chatting, and I quickly learned his name was Daniel. He was charming, easy to talk to, and had a confidence about him that was almost contagious. We talked about everything from our favorite books to travel, and before I knew it, an hour had passed. There was something magnetic about him, and I found myself drawn to his intelligence and wit. Later, when I told Sarah and Emily about our conversation, they were all over it. "You have to go for it," Emily said, practically bouncing with excitement. "He sounds perfect." At first, I was hesitant. After all, it was just a vacation, and I wasn't looking for anything serious. But as the days went by, I kept running into him. It seemed like everywhere I turned, there was Daniel. By the pool, at the bar, even in the casino one night. Every time we saw each other, he made a point of striking up a conversation, and I felt that familiar flutter in my stomach. There was something effortless about our interactions, and yet, at the back of my mind, a tiny voice whispered that it was a little too convenient, but I shrugged it off, convincing myself that it was all just coincidence. By the end of the third day, we were spending more and more time together. He invited me to dinner at one of the ship's fancier restaurants, and after some encouragement from my friends, I agreed. It seemed like harmless fun. What could go wrong on a cruise full of people? Little did I know, that dinner would mark the beginning of something far more sinister. Dinner with Daniel felt like a scene from a romantic movie. The restaurant was candlelit, the kind of place you could only find on a ship this grand. The ocean shimmered in the distance through the windows, and soft jazz music played in the background. Daniel was every bit as charming as I remembered. We laughed, exchanged stories, and by the time dessert arrived, I had almost forgotten the strange feeling I'd had earlier. Almost. During the meal, Daniel kept steering the conversation toward personal topics, my work, my family, and even whether I often took trips like this with my friends. It wasn't intrusive at first, just curious, but it started to feel specific. When he asked how often I was alone on the ship, I felt a small twinge of unease. "Do your friends always stick close?" he asked, smiling, but there was a strange intensity in his eyes. I laughed it off, saying they like to explore on their own sometimes, but my stomach was in knots. Why was he asking this? And why did it feel so important to him? As the night wore on, I began to notice other little things. The way he watched me, like he was studying my every move. The subtle change in his voice when I mentioned I wasn't interested in any serious relationships. But I pushed those thoughts aside, telling myself I was overreacting. After all, we were just two people enjoying a vacation. At the end of the night, as we left the restaurant, Daniel suggested we go back to his cabin for a drink. I hesitated, suddenly feeling a tightness in my chest. My friends would be expecting me back soon, but the look on his face made it hard to refuse. "Just for a little while," he insisted, his smile returning. "We can have one more drink and then I'll walk you back to your room." Against my better judgment, I agreed. What harm could there be in one last drink? Daniel's cabin was on a higher deck, larger and more luxurious than I had imagined. As soon as I stepped inside, though, I felt a shift in the air. The door clicked shut behind me, and the cozy atmosphere that had existed between us all night suddenly evaporated. I sat on the edge of the small couch while Daniel moved around the room, pouring us drinks. My eyes darted around, taking in the space, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had started to grow in the pit of my stomach. Something felt wrong. He handed me a glass, and I thanked him, though I barely touched the drink. The air in the cabin felt stifling, and I suddenly wished I hadn't agreed to come up here. "Relax," Daniel said, his voice lower, more commanding than it had been before. He sat down beside me, closer than I expected, his knee brushing against mine. I shifted uncomfortably, trying to keep the conversation light, but he was no longer interested in small talk. His eyes lingered on me, and his smile had faded into something I couldn't quite place. "I think I should head back," I said, setting my glass down. "My friends are probably wondering where I am." Daniel's expression darkened. "It's still early," he said, his tone flat now, devoid of the warmth he had shown all evening. "Besides, I thought we were having a good time." My pulse quickened. Before I could finish, he stood up, blocking the door with his body. His eyes locked onto mine, and the intensity in them made my heart race with fear. "You're not going anywhere," he said softly, but there was nothing soft about the look on his face. The room felt like it was closing in on me. I was trapped. The charming man I had met just days ago was gone, replaced by someone dangerous, someone I didn't recognize. My mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was only one door, and he was standing right in front of it. For a few seconds, I was frozen in place, my mind struggling to catch up with the reality of the situation. Daniel's eyes never left mine, and his stance was rigid, like he was daring me to challenge him. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave. But how? He was standing right in front of the only exit. "I really need to go," I said again, my voice shaking this time. "Please, just move out of the way." He didn't budge. Instead, his smile reappeared, but it was different now. Sinister, predatory. "Why are you in such a rush? We're just getting started." I stood up, heart pounding in my chest. I had to play this carefully. "I'll be back later, okay? I just need to check in with my friends." As I took a step toward the door, Daniel reached out and grabbed my arm, pulling me back toward him. The grip was strong, too strong. Panic surged through me as I yanked my arm away, but he tightened his hold. "You're not leaving." His voice was low, a threat disguised as calm. Adrenaline kicked in, and I knew I had to act fast. I glanced at the glass I had set down earlier, still within reach on the small coffee table. Without thinking, I grabbed it and threw it directly at him. It wasn't enough to hurt him, but it startled him just long enough for me to pull free from his grip. I darted for the door, fumbling with the handle. My hands were shaking so badly I could hardly turn it. Behind me, I could hear him cursing, and I knew I had only seconds before he'd be on me again. With one final twist, the door flew open, and I bolted into the hallway. I didn't stop running. My heart pounded in my chest as my feet carried me down the long, narrow corridors of the ship. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears, and I could hear the distant thumping of music from the party still happening on the upper deck. It felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Every few steps, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see Daniel chasing after me, but the halls remained empty. Still, the terror gripped me, refusing to let go. I needed to find someone, anyone, who could help. As I turned a corner, I nearly collided with a group of passengers laughing and chatting as they made their way to the pool deck. They barely noticed me as I stumbled past them, too absorbed in their own fun to see the panic on my face. I kept moving, my eyes searching for the reception desk, the one place I knew would have staff on hand to help. Finally, I spotted it at the end of the hallway, and relief flooded through me. I rushed forward, nearly collapsing against the counter as I tried to catch my breath. "Please, I need help," I gasped, my voice barely above a whisper. "There's a man. He's dangerous. He's back in his room. Please, you have to help me." The receptionist, a young woman who had been casually typing at her computer, looked up with wide eyes as I leaned against the counter, gasping for air. For a moment, she just stared, clearly not expecting someone in my state to appear in front of her. "Miss, are you okay?" she asked, her voice uncertain. I shook my head, barely able to form the words. "There's a man in his room. He tried to stop me from leaving. You have to do something, please." She glanced over my shoulder, as if expecting someone else to appear behind me, but the hallway remained empty. Her fingers hesitated over the phone on her desk. "What room is he in? What's going on?" I explained as best I could, though the words came out rushed and disjointed. I told her about Daniel, how he had blocked the door, how I had barely escaped. As I spoke, I could see her expression shift from confusion to concern. She finally picked up the phone, dialing for security. "We'll send someone to check on it right away," she assured me, though her tone seemed more cautious than confident. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, feeling a surge of relief that someone was finally listening. But the fear hadn't completely left me. What if Daniel was still out there? What if he was watching, waiting for the right moment to find me again? "I just want to be somewhere safe," I whispered, my voice trembling. The next few hours felt like a blur. The ship's security took my statement, and they sent a team to check Daniel's cabin. I was brought to a quiet room near the front desk, given water, and asked to wait while they sorted everything out. But when the officers returned, the look on their faces only deepened my anxiety. "He's gone," one of them said, shaking his head. "There's no sign of him in the room." I stared at him in disbelief. "What do you mean, he's gone?" "We searched the entire cabin," he continued, "but there was nothing unusual. His belongings are still there, but no one's seen him since you left. We've checked the cameras, but it's like he vanished." Vanished. The word hit me like a punch to the gut. How could someone just disappear from a ship in the middle of the ocean? My mind raced, replaying the events of the night over and over. Had I imagined it all? Had the danger been real? But the bruises forming on my arm from where he had grabbed me were proof enough. "He's still out there," I muttered, more to myself than anyone else. The officer gave me a concerned look. "We'll keep looking, but for now, try to stay with your friends. We'll notify you if anything changes." I nodded, but as I walked back toward my cabin, surrounded by the hum of the ship and the oblivious passengers enjoying their vacation, I couldn't shake the feeling that Daniel wasn't gone at all. Somewhere, somehow, he was still out there, and I might never be safe again. Hey everyone! If you enjoyed the stories, leave a comment. Your feedback is really important to us. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. It really helps the channel. Thank you for watching.